The year was 1848, and the Atlantic carried more than cotton, rice, and tobacco. It carried whispers. Imagine the black water at night, no moon, no stars, just the outline of a merchant ship rocking in silence. On its deck, small shapes shivered, not slaves, not immigrants, but children, barefoot, hollow-eyed, their mouths stuffed with cloth to keep them quiet. They were not being rescued, they were being traded. For every crate of opium unloaded on America's coast, one child disappeared into the night. It was a pact, a secret route running from Charleston to Canton, from New Orleans to Havana. Some called it the cradle trade. The first reports spoke of orphanages thinning their numbers. Churches explained it away as placement, but the records did not match. Baptism rolls ended mid-sentence, census sheets omitted names. By the time investigators noticed the pattern, hundreds were already gone. Some say they were sold into brothels in Shanghai, others to experimental colonies where science could act unchecked, but others never surfaced. The ocean keeps its secrets, but the shoreline remembers. Families whispered of strange chests buried in marshland. Fishermen swore they pulled up bones tangled in their nets. The ports were haunted not by ghosts, but by paperwork too carefully burned. This is the story America buried, how its most sacred institutions turned children into contraband. Charleston in 1848 was a city of contradictions. Stately mansions lined its streets, while the stench of human cargo still clung to its docks. Though the transatlantic slave trade was illegal, the port bustled with shadow commerce. Beneath the official routes of rice and indigo moved a darker ledger, one written in whispers and sealed in blood. Here the opium ships docked, not openly, but under the protection of merchants whose names carried weight in both the State House and the church. Records show vessels leaving under strange manifests, miscellaneous goods, textiles, or sometimes simply cargo unlisted. Yet inside were children, taken from New York orphanages, from Appalachian farmsteads, even from widows who believed they were giving their young to missionary schools. The truth was that Charleston became the first hub of the trade. The smugglers used its fractured social order, its secret societies, and its constant movement of enslaved bodies as cover. What was one more child missing in a city where loss was ordinary? The opium merchants had perfected their disguise. They presented themselves as philanthropists, funding schools, donating to churches, building almshouses. They hid the trade in plain sight, turning morality into a mask. To walk down Broad Street in 1848 was to see prosperity built on coffins too small to bury. And yet, not a single newspaper dared print the rumors. Those who asked questions were quietly removed, from pulpits, from courts, sometimes from life itself. It is always the most trusted hand that hides the knife. In Charleston, the First Presbyterian Church was more than a house of worship. It was a place where smugglers sealed their oaths. Its ministers preached salvation while blessing ledgers that sold children for narcotics. The ritual was simple. The congregation sang hymns, the collection plates passed, but in the vestry, behind a door marked records, the true business unfolded. Deacons signed papers that transferred wards of the church into the hands of the sponsors overseas. Each name marked down was another body shipped across the ocean. Families entrusted their children to God's house. Widows placed their faith in its promises, and the church turned that faith into currency. Some parishioners began to suspect. One woman described hearing a faint cry from the cellar during Sunday worship, muffled but unmistakable. Another swore she saw a procession of small figures led through the back door at dawn. But suspicion was never enough. To accuse the church was to accuse God himself, and that was a sin no jury would forgive. By 1848, the church was not only complicit, it was central. The smuggling routes began and ended at its altar. The Bible on the pulpit was heavy not with scripture, but with silence, and the silence was bought, paid for, and sanctified. It always begins with a promise. In the 1840s, orphanages across the eastern seaboard expanded faster than they could be funded. Small brick houses turned into sprawling compounds, often under the patronage of wealthy merchants who insisted they were protecting the unwanted. Mothers who had lost husbands to cholera, war, or debt left their infants in these institutions with tears in their eyes. but with faith they would be raised under God's hand. But records reveal a chilling pattern. Whole ledgers of children vanished overnight, struck from lists as if they had never existed. Staff explained the absences as placements with Christian families, but no family names were recorded, no addresses, no follow-ups. Whistleblowers later testified that these orphanages were designed not for charity but for selection. Children were examined as livestock: teeth, posture, obedience, all noted in coded language. The youngest and healthiest were marked with chalk, then taken for relocation. They never returned. Inside one abandoned orphanage in Savannah, a diary was found decades later beneath a rotting floorboard. The final entry read, "Sister Agnes took 12 last night. They cried for hours. Father says it is the Lord's will, but I cannot see God in their silence." The orphanage doors remained open to the public. The hymns rang out on Sundays. The donors paraded their generosity in newspapers, but every brick of those institutions was laid with the bones of the forgotten. Orphanages were not sanctuaries, they were warehouses. And in 1848, America's most vulnerable became its most valuable contraband. The ships looked ordinary, merchant vessels, broad in hull, flying flags of neutral trade. To a casual observer, they carried cotton, molasses, maybe timber. But those who walked their decks after midnight described something different. Hidden beneath false floors and hollowed cargo holds were cradles, small wooden compartments lined with straw, each just large enough for a child to curl inside. Ventilation was disguised as storage gaps. Noise was muffled with layers of fabric and tar. They called them floating cradles, but no lullabies were sung there, only muffled sobs, choked by cloth stuffed into small mouths to silence them. Sailors who manned these vessels told conflicting stories. Some claimed they believed they were transporting indentured servants for colonial outposts. Others swore they had no idea children were on board at all. But one journal smuggled from a sailor's chest reveals the truth. "We are told not to look under the floor, but I heard them last night, like kittens mewling in a sack. The captain says if we speak, we drown. I pray I never hear such cries again." The ships docked quietly at night, under names that changed every voyage. In Charleston, in Havana, in Hong Kong. The children were offloaded with the same care as porcelain, indelicate, breakable, and profitable. By the time dawn broke, the holds were empty. Only the faint smell of sickness lingered, clinging to the wood, and the sea, ever faithful, washed away the rest. The ocean does not keep secrets, it swallows them. No horror thrives without complicity. It is easy to believe every child was stolen in the dead of night, ripped from desperate mothers. Many were, but not all. There were families who sold their own. In the Appalachian Mountains, poverty was a noose that tightened every winter. Crops failed, fathers drank, mothers begged, and men with coin in their pockets arrived promising a better life for the children. Education abroad, they called it missionary training. Some families wept as they signed the papers. Others did not weep at all. One account from a Tennessee farm widow survives. She wrote, "The man came on a Sunday. He said my boy would learn letters in China, then return as a teacher. He gave me 5 silver coins. I prayed over my boy. He waved as they took him down the road. I have not seen him again, nor has any letter come." But whispers say some families were not fooled. They knew exactly what they sold their children into. For $5, for 10, they exchanged blood for survival. The smugglers counted on desperation. They knew hunger bends morality, and that grief can be silenced with silver. Generations later, families refused to speak of it. Genealogies left blank spaces where certain children should have been. The silence was its own inheritance. America's forgotten trade was not just imposed from above. It was fed from below, by those willing to sacrifice flesh for bread. If Charleston was the entry point, New Orleans was the mouth that swallowed everything whole. By 1848, the city pulsed with shadow markets, gambling halls, brothels, taverns where smoke coiled like living things. But beneath the laughter and music, another scent lingered: opium. Imported through hidden channels, opium was more than a drug. It was currency, In back rooms lit by gas lamps, merchants weighed it against human lives. Children smuggled from the East Coast were bartered for bricks of resin. A child could be traded for as little as a pouch. A shipment of 50 could fuel an entire quarter of dens for months. The dens themselves became graveyards of identity. Sailors described seeing children dressed in foreign silks paraded for buyers like exotic goods. Others never saw daylight again, kept in cellars as house servants, for addicts too far gone to care. One surviving police report tells of a raid in 1850. Officers broke into a warehouse on Magazine Street and found rows of small beds, each stained with sickness. No children were present, only scraps, a doll missing an eye, a child's shoe, a diary with just 3 words repeated, "Don't forget me." The city pretended not to know. Newspapers mocked rumors of phantom children. Officials accepted bribes. Priests prayed over the addicted, but not the vanished. New Orleans flourished as a port of sin, and in its veins ran 2 addictions, one for the opium that dulled pain, and one for the children who disappeared into its smoke. Every route has a shadow road. For America's child opium trade, that shadow ran through the mountains. The Appalachian Trail, today known for wilderness and beauty, was once a corridor of silence. In the 1840s, wagons moved not only timber, salt, and whiskey, but something more fragile. Children, they were packed into hay carts, hidden beneath sacks of grain, moved slowly through valleys where no one asked questions. The smugglers called it the quiet road, because it relied not on force but on absence. No records, no witnesses, no trails of ink. Farmers along the ridges spoke of strange noises in the night. A wagon creaking long after midnight, followed by what sounded like muffled cries. Hunters claimed they found scraps of fabric, tiny shirts, ribbons, shoes, caught on branches deep in the woods. The route ended in hidden river landings where barges waited. From there, the children were floated to larger ports and swallowed by the international tide. Decades later, hikers reported finding carved initials on old birch trees. Tiny letters, shallow and trembling, like a last attempt to say, "I was here," but the silence of the mountains is heavy. It swallows sound, memory, and confession. And in that silence, America buried its darkest road. The smugglers did not operate alone. They needed records, receipts, a way to track what was lost. And for that, they turned to an unlikely custodian, the church seminaries. One seminary in Virginia, the St. Augustine School of Divinity, kept meticulous files. On the surface, they were baptism records, adoption lists, missionary placements. But hidden in coded ledgers, bound in leather and kept in locked cabinets, was the true archive. Each child was listed not by name, but by number, alongside notes on age, physical condition, and destination. Some codes read E, C, East China, others N, O, New Orleans. The files were clinical, stripped of humanity, as though the children were cattle. When the seminary burned in 1871, locals celebrated the survival of its library. But few knew that among the saved books was a collection of ledgers sealed in iron boxes. Whispered rumors claimed priests argued over whether to destroy them. In the end, they chose silence over fire. One former student of the seminary years later wrote in a private letter, "We were told these records were sacred, but I remember the smell of mildew and tears in those pages. I believe we were preserving hell itself." Today, the ledgers are said to be hidden in a diocesan vault, sealed by order of the church. Historians searching for them find only locked doors and silence. The seminary taught theology, yes, but it also taught how to bury sin in Scripture. Every great crime requires not just silence, but permission. By the late 1840s, questions had begun to reach Washington. Reports from local sheriffs about missing children. Rumors from sailors who claimed to hear cries beneath deck planks. Even a senator from Massachusetts pressed for an inquiry into irregularities in orphan distribution. But nothing happened. Letters from the period suggest why. One unsigned document, discovered in the archives of the Library of Congress, warned that trade with Canton depends upon discretion. Cargo must flow uninterrupted. Another, marked private, reminded federal marshals that certain transfers are necessary for the nation's prosperity. Opium was not merely a vice, it was a tool of empire.
Britain's wars in China had shown the West the wealth opium could command. America wanted a share, and if the price was its children, the government looked away. Customs officials were bribed. Judges dismissed cases without trial. Naval officers who stopped suspicious ships were quietly reassigned. The system worked not because it was invisible, but because it was untouchable. Whispers spread that the president himself had been briefed and chose silence. No proof survives, but history often leaves fingerprints rather than signatures. In the end, the trade was not merely a crime of smugglers and churches. It was a crime of the nation itself. Truth has a way of leaking through cracks. In 1852, the family of a sailor named Elias Morton received 3 letters. He had signed aboard the Mercy Jane, a ship registered in Charleston. His letters tell a story of descent. The first was full of hope. "We sail for Canton with fine goods. The pay is steady, and I will return with coin enough for us all." The second grew darker. "There are strange sounds below. I think it may be rats, but they cry too much like children. I cannot sleep." The third was never meant to be read. Found in a trunk after his disappearance, it bore stains of water and something darker. "They make us carry them at night. Tiny hands reaching through the slats. The captain says they are cargo, nothing more, but cargo does not weep. I fear I will go mad. If I do not return, know that our country profits from stolen angels." Elias never came home. The Mercy Jane docked, but his name was absent from the manifest. Officials claimed he drowned at sea, but sailors whispered he had spoken too loudly and the ocean had been chosen as his coffin. His letters remain. Torn, brittle, but undeniable. Proof not only of what happened, but of how truth is punished when it dares to speak. At the center of every shadow trade lies a ritual. The smugglers of the Chile, opium route, bound themselves by oath, a pact older than law. Witnesses describe ceremonies held in the basements of Charleston mansions, by candlelight, over maps stained with wax. The oath was simple but chilling. Each man swore upon a child's shoe placed on the altar. They pledged silence unto death. They pledged profit over mercy. They pledged to forget the faces of those they carried. One account, recovered from a diary seized in an 1860 raid, records the words, "We swear to the waters that swallow, to the silence that keeps us, and to the God who does not answer. Let our tongues rot before we betray the trade." Some participants were not sailors at all, but politicians, priests, merchants, the very men sworn to protect communities. Their wealth was tethered to the oath, their futures secured by it, and those who broke it. Legends tell of bodies found along the marshes, tongues cut out, eyes covered with wax. The message was clear. Silence was not only expected, it was enforced. The oath was not superstition, it was machinery. It kept the trade alive for decades, feeding both the veins of addicts and the coffers of America's most powerful. The smugglers were not criminals in shadows. They were respected men in daylight, and the oath made sure no one remembered the difference. It was the drought of 1873 that revealed it. Farmers near the Savannah River noticed the water lane falling, mud banks splitting open like old wounds, and there in the shallow muck bones appeared, not the long bones of men. Smaller, fragile, dozens of them. Authorities claimed the site was an old cemetery, the remains of children lost to cholera, but the truth whispered through the fields was more disturbing. The bones bore signs of suffocation, not disease. Jawbones still clenched with scraps of cloth. Tiny finger bones fused together as though they had grasped something in terror. A fisherman claimed he saw wooden chests wedged deep in the mud, crates nailed shut, their contents spilling as the river receded. He swore he found a rusted lock with markings not in English, but in Chinese characters. He turned it over to local police. It vanished into evidence never seen again. For years afterward, locals avoided the bend in the river. They said the ground stank of mildew, of salt, and of grief. Hunters refused to camp there, claiming they heard children laughing faintly at night, though no prints were ever found. The site was eventually covered by flood again, as if the river itself was eager to close its mouth. But for a brief season, America's buried secret rose like a corpse in shallow water. And it reminded those who saw it that not all graves carry names or prayers. There is a language of erasure, colder than silence. In shipping records of the 1840s and 1850s, human children were reduced to cargo codes. They were listed alongside sugar, rum, and cloth, described not as souls, but as inventory. One surviving ledger from a Charleston merchant contains an entry that reads, 12 units, small, fragile, handle with care. Another marks a shipment as perishables, that were usually reserved for fruit, was applied to children. The transformation was deliberate. By calling them cargo, smugglers erased their humanity. A weeping child became a unit. A life became profit. This was not only language, it was a ritual of control. One sailor's confession explains it best. If you call them children, you see their faces in your sleep. If you call them cargo, you count them like barrels. The name makes the work possible. Those records were signed by men who later became governors, bankers, judges. Their names still appear on plaques across the South, honored as pioneers and benefactors, yet in their ledgers behind neat columns of ink are the ghosts of hundreds of vanished children. History books will not tell you this. They say these men built commerce, expanded trade, strengthened the nation. They never say what or who they sold to do it. The route was not one-sided. The children did not simply vanish into America's ports. They were part of a global transaction. China, already broken by the Opium Wars, became the other half of the exchange. American merchants traded children as collateral for shipments of opium. In Canton, certain warehouses became infamous. They were called cradle houses. Here, American children were kept in rows of bamboo pens, like livestock. Some were sold into brothels. Others were absorbed into forced labor camps under the guise of apprenticeships. The youngest, it is said, were given to wealthy households as curiosities, foreign trophies to be dressed in silks and displayed. But the darkest whispers come from medical records. A handful of translated documents from the late Qing era describe Western specimens used in experimental studies of disease. It is unclear how many children met this fate, but their names never returned to American soil. Merchants on both sides profited. The Chinese opium syndicates grew stronger. American smugglers returned home rich. The children remained in between, their lives erased in ledgers written in 2 languages. This was not charity, it was not mission work. It was commerce at its most depraved. One empire feeding another with the currency of its most innocent. And through it all, both nations pretended not to see. There is a house in Savannah whose shutters never open. Locals call it the House of Orphans, though no children play there now. Built in 1846, it was originally run by a charitable society. Its mission, shelter abandoned youth. Its reality, selection and disappearance. Ledgers show that dozens of children entered its gates every year. Yet photographs taken for donors always showed the same faces, smiling, dressed in starched uniforms. The troubling detail, the children never seem to age. The same boy appears in a photograph from 1848 and again in 1853, unchanged. The same girl in 1850, then in 1857, identical. Historians argue the photos were staged, recycled for propaganda. But whispers tell another story, that these children never left because they were never alive at all. They were stand-ins borrowed for the image while the real orphans were shipped away. The building still stands, its windows blackened with mildew. Neighbors swear they hear the sound of children singing faint hymns at dusk, though the house has been empty for over a century. The orphans who entered its walls never grew old. They simply vanished, their faces captured in photographs that lie like saints' icons, smiling, eternal, and utterly false. The house is a monument not to charity, but to disappearance. Economic history records the panic of 1851 as a financial downturn. Banks collapsing, businesses shuttering, plantations falling into debt. But what the textbooks omit is how perfectly the panic distracted from something far darker. During the same year, a series of shipments vanished from records. 3 orphanages closed abruptly. Several smugglers disappeared, their estates liquidated. Newspapers filled every page with panic over failing markets, leaving no ink for missing children. Letters recovered decades later suggest deliberate overlap. One Charleston banker wrote, "This panic is providence. While the public frets over coin, our greater matters will pass unnoticed." Greater matters. That phrase appears in 3 separate letters, all connected to men later identified as financiers of the trade. Some scholars believe the panic was not an accident at all, but orchestrated, financial chaos staged to bury human chaos. Families searching for lost children found no ears willing to hear. The entire nation was trained to look at numbers, not faces. By the time stability returned, the trail was cold. Records had been burned. Witnesses silenced, children dispersed. The panic of 1851 was not just an economic collapse, it was a curtain, and behind it the trade continued unseen. Some wounds bleed through time. In rural Georgia, the Callahan family became infamous for its misfortunes. Every generation lost children to unexplained disappearances. Some vanished from their beds, others were taken by fever, with no doctors present. Family trees in their Bible contain blank spaces where names should be. The curse, locals whispered, began in 1848, when the Callahan patriarch sold 2 of his children to smugglers for money to save his plantation. He prospered briefly, but within a year, tragedy followed. His wife hanged herself in the barn. His surviving sons died in accidents too strange to be believed. The pattern repeated across decades. Whenever a Callahan child reached the age of 7, calamity struck. Drownings, disappearances, fevers that struck without warning. By 1900, the family estate was abandoned. Neighbors swore the windows glowed at night with the shapes of small figures moving inside. Hunters avoided the land, saying the cries of children echoed across the fields though no one lived there. The curse was not mystical, it was memory. A family that traded its blood for silver had condemned itself to silence, to absence, to erasure. The Callahans were only one family, but they became a symbol, proof that even generations later, the sins of 1848 had not been buried, they were still collecting their debt.